this is not just an exercise to get leaders data. And don't miss the bigger picture. This is an opportunity to build trust and bring your employees into this process of developing, designing your organization and your culture as things change and evolve.
Hey, it's Nikki Llewellyn-Gregory, and you're on Gut Plus Science. You're in for a fast-paced, storytelling, action item-rich leadership growth experience. I hope you make this podcast a habit. I consider it a leadership mentoring tool. Learning together makes us better together, and that is how we change the world around us. Let's get to it. So guys, my guest today shares a mission that is very similar to mine. His, to help the world work better by improving how we work. Yes, more of these people with missions like this, please. I truly call these people, like Craig, the biggest world changers because we spend the most of our waking hours in life on Earth, our entire time here, working. So why not make it better and help people really thrive from that time spent? So I don't need to go on my soapbox with Craig about that. We're just going to dig in. Let me tell you about him. He's the founder of Culture C Consulting, and his tagline is bridging the art and science of workplace culture. Another alignment, gut plus science, art and science. Like Craig, we're like long lost best friends, I think. So Craig is obsessed with how humans work, both individually and together. And he knows how to use data to lead people and culture forward. So that's really what I want to dig in on today. I think, Craig, there's a lot of fear around data. Like, oh, if we do this, then what, right? Like you hear those things, but I want to know, address the fear. Why do leaders and employees both shy away from data?
Yeah, it's such a good question. One I've thought a lot more about more recently, because if you step back for a second, the question is my journey of trying to bring data to the table and the power of it. And when you know that and you do this work, but you still see the apprehension or resistance or what gets in the way. I love to ask that question versus, what gets in the way of making the moves. It might be a leader, what gets in the way of difficult conversations, all those kinds of things. So, which could be fear too. One of the things that get in the way is fear. And I think, look, I had an analogy, and every time I share a little bit about my life, but about a year ago, we were just doing some cleanup around the house. And we moved a bed and we realized there had been some mold on a wall behind a bed. And we knew we had to, call somebody in. And at the time I was going through leaving corporate world, starting my own business, right? Finances were tight. And I knew that part of the thing was going to be, they're going to say, let's open the wall, right? And as much as that probably needed to be done, there was an apprehension. I didn't want to open the wall. You know why? Because I didn't want to know what else was going on and realize that this might be a bigger issue that I have to deal with. And I think that's such a great metaphor for organizations and data, particularly around some of these things that, we all mean well, but we also know that if we shine a bigger light or we look more deeply, we might uncover something we don't want to deal with. And there's this old adage, if I can't measure it, if I can't see it, doesn't exist. So I don't think people are waking up, walking around saying, I'm not going to do this. I think it's a very natural apprehension. And really, I try to approach it more from a place of empathy when working with organizations and be like, it's okay. Like, let's just take the step by step. It doesn't have to be as scary as you might imagine. And to top that story off, we had some people come out, they tested it. They said, this is not dangerous. You don't have to open the wall. Here's how we treat it. So it worked all right. But that apprehension was still there. So I think it's the same thing in organizations. There was a quote, something of the fact that everybody wants to do something righteous and big in the world, but no, they don't want to be scrutinized along the way. And I think it's that same kind of ideology that we're all setting out to do big things, talk to people, leaders, and organizations. They do, but sometimes the scrutiny can be intense, and no one runs intense scrutiny over their work, or oftentimes not. So I think that's where the fear comes in, or at least how I think about it, how to address it in the context of this work.
And I'm curious, when you find leaders that you've worked with where the fear isn't there, and you start to think of the people that you've worked with in your life, and you're starting to see these people as I'm asking you this question, what was the common thread that differentiated them that you think?
Well, I feel like at some level, I peel it back. I feel like every time I've worked with a client that's really bringing in an analytics tool or, because my work's around helping quantify, measure culture, and then really dig in and understand and pinpoint. So anytime I've started where they haven't been down that path, so sometimes it's more of a transition, I think it's there a little bit. I pick up on it in different ways. I pick up on the people that are working with the leaders to bring it in, or how much to share with them, or they're getting a little anxious about this. I think what it really is going back to the value, just the same as, the mold issue. Like, it's important we deal with this. It's not healthy. It's not safe for your family. And I think with the organizations, it's really just connecting the dots that oftentimes they also don't know what's possible. So that's the other thing that gets in the way. I think when it comes to data and culture, the standard for a lot of people that don't do this work is like, I don't know where to begin. What? And I think helping them understand what's possible and what the benefit is going to be, right? If I can go to a leader and say, overall, your intent to stay. So that's a question around people's intention on, I see myself here in some sort of future amount of time. It's really strong. You're probably not going to have high turnover. But if I dig in, I can see that your accounting team and your engineering team have much higher scores. Do you want to know about that so we can pinpoint and talk about retention in those areas to kind of get ahead of it? And I think when you can talk that language, which is really the bigger picture, it's storytelling with data. Of course they want to know. And then the other piece for anybody that's doing this kind of work is then the work is the human work of making it easy. Our job is to go, a lot of times people in this space, all of us in some way or another are doing something. We're way out in the deep end and we love it. It's fine. And we want other people to be there. But hollering from the deep end, saying, come join me here to somebody that hasn't really swam much is not a good strategy. It's our job to go to the shore to get them and to bring them out to the deep end. So I think that's really the art and the empathy of it. The art, I'd say the empathy of it all is to meet them where they are and realize, of course, if you haven't done this before, you don't know what's coming. I do. We can get there. And what are the first basic steps to start to bring that value and make them feel safer and be their guide?
I'm excited to hear a couple of stories from you today, or at least one of a client that you've worked with and how data truly transformed their workplace. But before we do that, I was trying to put myself into I am on the other side. Say I'm working with you. And for me, I don't think it's the fear of the data. For me, it would be the prolonging of the lift. And in that prolonging of the lift, because I'm like, we got too much going on. I know that this is going to be so much. Yes, it could be so valuable, but I'm going to keep pushing it off. I'm going to keep pushing it off. And I'm sure you've had clients like that where it's like it's about go time. And then they're like, you know what? I think we should wait another year, right? It has to be because they're scared. And I guess, I don't know if scared is the right word. They just are adverse to the lift and the time it's going to take away from the other things that might be more immediate gratification or something. So I want to hear, when it comes to someone like me that could easily do that, what am I creating? Like the outcomes that I could be creating that are really negative because I keep putting it off. You've probably seen stories like that. Like how does that manifest when we don't approach it?
I talk a lot about my work. Another metaphor I use is kind of like, and I think this is a good one, especially if we go deeper into this conversation of helping organizations do getting a full blood panel done. You go to the doctor and getting your blood work done. And the reason is because there's a couple things. One is if you do that consistently every 6 months, think of the value. If you change your diet, if something happens, maybe there's something happening where if you went in once, you wouldn't notice it. But if you did it every 6 months, your doctor can say, this thing just shot up, not above bad levels, but gosh, it just moved. We should look deeper into that, right? Think about that information that you don't have, but I know sometimes pushing off, like, oh, go physical, don't want to do the blood check. What if my cholesterol's high? All those things. So I think it's the same sort of thing for organizations, because once we get it going, now they've invested in a training program. Now they've done something else, and we can go back and look and go, that those teams that went through it, look at this. And especially as a deep dive, you didn't expect this to go up or that, or maybe it wasn't impactful at all. So until you start, you don't even have a baseline. So I think with those organizations, it's reiterating the long-term value versus this is not just a snapshot. Now, I'm trying to work with organizations to build a muscle of regularly go and just take a high level look. Because look, surveys are not the only. There's more to this, but without that, it feels like you're kind of flying blind without some way to go in every once in a while and get just a high level snapshot across the board and reassess. Is where we've been investing our time and energy still the right place? Should we change? Is there another issue? The world's changed. Our employees have changed. We've had a lot of turnover. We've grown. We've shrunk. Whatever it might be, to have a touch point. So maybe it's not fear that you feel about going to do that thing, but do you really want to go? And then you go, and what you might find out, it's just kind of a drag. But there's a real big value there. So really helping just drive back to that value and then it feels like, as you ask that question, kind of the typical sales response of helping them understand by putting off another year, what you think is just another headache is why wouldn't you? Would you put off another year of putting in a marketing tool when you have no insight into your marketing? Or what company wouldn't use a Salesforce that's or something like a CRM once they're up and running? It just doesn't make sense. And I think it's that mental shift of saying, there's so much you're missing here. You're saying you're running a business, you don't have time, but you're making decisions and spending money in places that you have no real way to track, measure, or see the impact. So you're going to go redo your comp program before we've had a chance to even look, is that the right place? Because that's expensive. So I think when we can reframe it that way and help realize this is something that, as much as it, at this moment seems like an extra thing, realize that you're probably costing, and it's costing you in many ways by not doing it. So why would we wait?
Your example of, like the blood panel thing, it's like, going and doing that regularly, takes some time, right? And it might be annoying to do that. But if we would wait 3 years, the repercussions of what we have to do, time, money, energy to fix it, because we could have got it when it was here at this little thing, but then it got so big.
Now there's some big problem. You go in and find that you could have caught exactly. And it's, I love that you reframed it that way, because that's exactly the situation.
And, the other side is one person making a decision, which, usually there's one person at the end of the day that's the final say. But we need to bring everyone along to see this. And one of the best ways to do that is if we're looking at data. Data tells a story. You can't really argue with it. And it helps people, walk through the journey. So you're probably going to get more into that. But I'm just thinking for myself, I'm like, Nikki, take this advice now. There's some things I have in my business that I need to think about.
And I feel like I'm on a metaphor analogy role here, but there's another one. This really came up when I was working with some of the admins or people that had already decided. Look, I worked at Culture Amp for a long time, so by the time they got to me, they had made the decision. I was there to help kind of guide and get it going. So I didn't have to deal a lot with that apprehension up front, but they made the decision. There's still the apprehension, to your point, as they're rolling it out. Do we do it now or whatnot? And so I'd be working often with the administrators, and they would talk about selling it to the leaders. And sometimes I'd find that they were trying to oversell it, and it goes back to that fear thing. You're sharing so much that it becomes overwhelming. So this idea kind of hit me. It was almost like the Fitbit. Like, if you're really trying to be more active and you have no tracking device, I as a doctor, let's say go back to the doctor, I could give you all the data and the research and why it's so important to move and health and your diet. And that doesn't really drive change. But if I said, look, hey, let's just do this. Here's a Fitbit or here's whatever, put it on your wrist. Let's take a look. Come back in a month. Let's see how you're doing. And you come back and you're getting 2,500 steps a day. The doctor could say, look, this is way low. What would it look like to get 4,000 steps a day? Why don't we try that? Let's come back in a month. There's my example of the basics. So I'd say to them is, do what you need to do to get the Fitbit on the wrist, get this up and running. Don't oversell it, because once we get going, what feels so overwhelming, it really isn't. And that's those steps is like the same thing as the data. Okay, you got the data, you realize one of these teams, you didn't want to see it, but it stings for a second. But then as a leader, you're like, that's good information. I really want that information. So it's just always like, don't boil the ocean. Figure out the easiest way to get the Fitbit on the wrist, to get the thing plugged in, and then we can evolve before you overwhelm them and they don't want to go forward.
That's really good. So we're going to start to walk into like an illustration of a client or two that did this and like how it really worked out in their favor to grow their business and their people and their culture, and then really break down like what to measure and how we measure. It's not just surveys. But before we do that, in case anyone is sitting here listening right now is like, measure what? Like, we could be measuring, things in an industry specific. We could be measuring accounting metrics, whatever. But we're here today to talk about people and culture. So give us just an example so people are like, what are we measuring?
We are measuring, look, there's different things we can measure. I worked for a company for many years, Culture Amp, which was a very big part of my journey and story. Culture Amp began by really rethinking the employee engagement survey. And what I mean by that is, historically, larger organizations would hire consultants to come in to run these. They were complex, they were large, it took a lot of legwork. They would do that, they would go back, they would process the data and information. It would typically take a few months, they'd come back, they'd report. By the time it made it to anybody, it was months later. And also consultants and then would say, here's what we found and here's how we can solve your problems. Culture Amp came along and said, with the data and technology we have today, why would organizations outsource their most important thing, their people and their culture, right? So taking an engagement survey, you can own that. We can put in place the best practices from, leading people science and organizational psychology, bake it into the tool, let you run it as far as the facilitation of it, keeping the data safe, really understanding and using, getting a higher level of metrics, and then being able to push that out to your leaders and your managers and drive that information into the organization so more people can have a hand in. Basically, organizations can own culture, own your own culture, don't outsource it. I came on to work with clients to help them use it. And I think that my background is just really a deep passion for organizations and culture. And I've seen it from different angles. But this was the most comprehensive, where I could come in and say, wow, I can sit with a group of leaders and provide some good data. But the point was, now we're having a real conversation, not a hypothetical one, or I'm just some expert coming in and espousing some viewpoint. It's more about, let's just start where we are. So that evolved. That could be onboarding. That could be, exit interviews. We can talk about this more, but I prefer stay interviews, whatever that might be, even 360s. They eventually got into performance management and other things. But most of what we're talking about here is built around this idea of the engagement survey, but more around some of the concepts on how do you, at any point in time, measure and get a snapshot at a large scale. So large scale listening, get a snapshot of what's going on, almost like it's like a polling exercise, and how to make meaning of it. So we talk about collect, understand, and act. And that's really the idea. Is the survey is just the collect part. How do we process and understand it? And then how do we take action? And that's what I'm supporting organizations around.
That's great. And also, too, I come from an employee engagement technology company background, building a partner program. And I'm just thinking about some of the outcomes. Like for those of you listening and you're like, I'm trying to drive retention to higher levels. I'm really looking for people to be, more productive in their role because it's just like in flow. And I want, the vibe here to be like, you can feel the energy. Like how do we like put some data on that to really raise that or know what it is that's holding it back? So
can I say real quick, I'm really happy you mentioned outcome. And I think anybody listening that's interested in this topic, what you just said is really important, because oftentimes we only focus on the thing we want to change. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble. I mean, think about a Wells Fargo, which is like, we need more accounts, or we need this, or sales, just get more sales. And I, with the work I've done, one of the things I've really learned is this idea of inputs and outputs. So oftentimes what I'm advising is, what's the outcome in this case, engagement? And, we could break that down, because I definitely have thoughts on what that means. But engagement's typically a hard one. If I told you that people don't have pride in your organization, or a team doesn't have pride, what's that manager going to do? So then it's a series of other questions that are more tactical, and then looking at the relationship between those questions and the outcomes. So the idea is focusing more on the inputs and not the outcomes. In a sales example, if it's more conversations, or if it's more deals, saying we know that if a salesperson makes more calls and has better calls and higher quality, and they're building rapport and they're following up with good information, that sales happen. Let's focus on the inputs and test that hypothesis to see the output. Because when we only say just get more deals, that's where we get ourselves into trouble. And it's the same thing with engagement. We often advise, don't bonus executives on engagement. If you've done a good job and you realize that leadership communication is the biggest driver of engagement, then look at that score and bonus your leaders on getting that score increased as a way to drive engagement, right? So I think it is a shift, and one that was an important shift in my learning along the way.
And I think, from a sales side of this, it is true that we have to meet our companies, our future clients, in a place that we're wanting to help them change something, right? There's something broken, there's something painful, or there's something aspirational, which is the outcome thing that is like, they're like, we don't want to be like this forever, right? There's something there. But then what you're saying applies to, let's say, you're on a weight loss journey, and man, you don't see the weight shedding right away, but you're doing the right activities. I'm drinking the water, I'm eating the protein levels, I'm going to the gym, I'm doing the cardio, I'm lifting the weight. And I think that's what you're saying with the inputs. It's like, yes, probably all of this will start because we have an end in mind, but we don't focus on that through the process. We focus on, the inputs are the things really that we can control.
And if you're doing all those things and it's not shifting, this goes back to the doctor thing again. Then there's something, what's going on? Let's take a look and understand. But if we have historical information about you, then we might say, every time you've done this before, it works. So let's focus on those things. And it seems to work. So let's do it healthy, not unhealthy. We can get the results we want in an unhealthy way. And let's be real. How many organizations get the results they want in an unhealthy way? Unsustainable way, short-term results that ultimately burn out people and don't create sustainability.
So when we talked before, you had a saying that I said, I want to make sure we capture that. Data can be compassionate. What do you mean?
Well, that came from, I got asked to speak at a conference called the Compassion 2.0 conference. And I was thinking about my topic and how to tie it in. And that's really what it came to be. And it's funny how that, how these things, daisy chain, I thought about it for that conference, but really it hit at something that I think I'm working really hard in my space and to communicate out, which is, I think when we say that word data is not compassionate by nature, right? And I think what I'm really getting at is really trying to change in organizations and say, this does not have to be a large spreadsheet with, hard numbers to get your head around. And when I share a story, I'll give that example, or we can lead into that. But can we really run an organization of over 50 people or 100 people, 500, 1,000 people, and not do a good job at listening and gathering data and listening at scale, right? And building in relationship with our employees versus how many times have I walked into a room of 10 people making decisions that are impacting lives and will be impacting lives in 6 months from that decision, which they're moved on. So what I think the compassionate piece is realizing that as I've done this work and watched how it shifts the conversation and the game, and I've also, my story is also, I came up, worked in restaurants and, military to put myself through school. And so I've seen the other side, and I've, been that employee. I've had some good experiences and bad ones that these things mean something and can really impact people's lives. And that when I go in and start to bring data and realize how the conversation shifts, or how some leader that probably would have gotten fired because somebody on the leadership team didn't like them, but then you realize that, their teams love them and that those teams are high performing. Do you still want to get rid of that person? Without the data, that would have been done. It's been done every day. So I think the compassion is realizing that we don't do a good job of assessing large groups of people. We think we do, and it only gets trickier if there's a bias that grows in our ability to understand large groups. Yet the sense that we do, right? If I have 30 employees, I can probably have 30 good conversations and really stay close. If I have 100, I'll keep having those 30 conversations, feeling like I'm having as many conversations, yet it starts to outgrow you. And what you think, if without validating, it could be biased. So I think the compassion, the empathy really comes from, I don't think it's very responsible at a certain level. Some of the times I walk to an organization and realize that you've got this many people depending on you, and this is the level of understanding you have of what's going on. So that's where that comes from.
That's really good. I like that. I like that as a challenge for all of us to take that mindset of data can be compassionate, and how can you as a leader be that way?
And I'll just say, as we go into the stories, look, I was given this title, people scientist. I talk about data, but the truth is, I'm more of a contextualizer of data. I'm not the guy that's going to come in and build a new system and do all the crunching of the numbers. I mean, I think there's way better tools and people out there to do that. I found that what I learned in my journey and my love for workplaces and workplace development is that it's so critical. And then with good data, then we can start to have real conversations and it just shifts. Like I said, it's the Fitbit thing. I think I'm getting exercise, therefore I am. Let's get honest. And it's such a powerful tool for somebody like me to really come in and do the next level of work, which is, okay, now what are we going to do? And let's come up with some big bets that are based on data. And we're going to do the blood work again to see, did it have the impact we were hoping? So it's a cycle. And it's a more responsible way, especially, this isn't about an individual, it's about an organization, that people are the stewards of many people's experience. So that goes back to the compassion and my drive and what I've seen, and wanting this for more people and more organizations.
And helps us limit our emotional decisions that we make, right? We all need a little bit more of that. Okay, so it's story time. Tell us a story about a favorite client where the process of bringing in data really helped them win, and maybe walk through what you measured and what did you use to measure.
Yeah, I'm going to share two stories I really enjoy sharing, and one's a little more probably more organizational, and one's sort of simple, which I love because I think it helps highlight this idea that when I talk about data, this is not staring at a spreadsheet. I was working with an organization. It was a new CEO of the organization. The CEO had history of being a CEO. He came in and he knew he was there to it had evolved to a place that, the founders were moved out and this new CEO came in. There were some challenges. Clearly, that's why he was there. And he had a lot on his plate. Like you can imagine, he's looking at this entire organization, where to begin. There's the culture piece, there's the finance piece, there's the operations piece. So I said, if we're going to do this work together, number one, we have to, I'm not going to do this, supporting you and doing these offsites without some data to base this on. That's kind of what I'm standing for. So we went ahead and we implemented and we ran our first survey. The deal was we're going to run it twice over the course of a year. So there'd be a beginning and an end. And when we got together and we started digging in, so this also speaks to having a good system that allows you to slice and dice on the fly and really get in there. We were looking at overall engagement scores and retention scores. So there's a question I mentioned before, intent to stay. I see myself here in 2 years' time, which is as good a predictor of any of understanding where your turnover is going to be. So we started looking and we looked at it. He said, can I look at this across our offices, right? So we were able to quickly like, okay, let's take a look at these scores separated by offices. And one of the offices scores were about 20 points lower than the other scores. And by the way, overall, the organization was looking really solid. But when you looked at it that way, you could see that one stood out in relation to the others. And he said, I knew it. I've known there's problems there. I mean, he's a brand new CEO. He had a sense there was. He said, but I knew it. When he saw it quantified, he said, I'm getting down there ASAP. And within 2 weeks, he went and spent some time down there. It was funny. He was like texting me and my partner saying, I'm down here. It's so great. I mean, it was awesome to hear him say that. He went down one more time, spent time on site there. And then we ran the survey again, and the points came up like 18 points around engagement. Now, I can't say 100%, but I can say from my purview and perspective, that was the biggest intervention that took place with that office. I really believe him simply going down there and spending time meant a lot. And those I mean, a CEO has a big level of influence, and the numbers came up, I think, because they got attention. And what that did was it was the information that told him where to look. He knew it wasn't like I told him there was a problem. He knew it, but he was able to quantify it. Was able to quantify it against the salesperson saying we need more headcount here, and another person saying we need X, Y, and Z. So I think that's the point, is that sometimes when presented the right way, we know what to do. He knew what to do. It just needed to be presented in the right way. So that was one story I love to tell about how data can support organizations. The second is a much larger organization, and for sure anybody in the United States knows this company, so I'm not going to share the name, but this is a big organization. I was working with the vice president of employee experience. She had been there for 15 years or something. She decided to, this was while I was at Culture Amp, so they decided they were going to use this tool. They had not used it before. And they ran their survey, and it validated some things that she had been seeing. But what she told me was she came to me after the fact. She said, Craig, I've been telling our executives about these problems for like the past 5 years, every single year saying it, and just really haven't gotten traction. And then we ran this tool, and I went in there with data and said the same thing. And 2 of the 5 made it into the organizational corporate objectives for the year, right? And she was just so grateful. And that's another example of, I think, one of the challenges, particularly in HR and people. I think sales and finance, other operations are better at this. With metrics haven't always been there. So for her to be able to go back to those leaders and tell the story and incorporate data, so mixing the emotion of the story with something quantifiable, which, let's be real, leaders just crave. They need that. It's how they operate. They're looking across lots of things. It's a game changer. So she was more empowered. And I think anybody that's trying to drive change around people and culture, bringing that layer in will make you more effective. And on the flip side, going back and saying, and look at the results because we invested that money. So, which is to like the first story. So those are the 2, I think, highlight some of those examples.
That's really good. And, we're talking about people and culture. And we talked about, in the beginning, your introduction, it's really about helping people find that meaningful work and that fit in the work world and really prioritizing that. And so much of what you just shared is data helps people feel seen, heard, valued, collectively on the same page. It like brings people together. And there's so much power in this helped me to understand you better, or this is helping us to have conversations that connect the dots. After 5 years, we've been saying the same thing, but the data helped us to be able to come together. So
I love what you said. We've talked so much about setting these up for leaders and getting leaders data. When I work with an organization, I'm really big on, if we just focus on that's one thing, but you hit something like one of the organizations I worked for, my focus was recognition and rewards, a company called Achievers. And the biggest aha I walked away from over those years was that fundamentally, and this is held across everything I've done since, fundamentally, people want to be seen and heard, like you mentioned. So one of the biggest problems with some of these surveys or running these programs is companies run them, they get all this information, they scurry around to do things, and they don't communicate back very well, or they try to do too much. And it's frustrating because what happens is you undermine. They're so focused on action that they miss the bigger picture of like, I'd rather you pick 1 or 2 things, say, we heard you, here's what we heard, here's what you can expect, and you do it, and you do something about it, and you check back in. Now you've gone from, hey, you got some data, to you formed a connection. I mean, like, this is, again, listening at scale. This is what we do when we're one-to-one, but if you have 1,000 employees, how do you do it at scale? And when you run a comprehensive survey or do something to gather data that people trust and believe in, and then you go back and say, we heard you. here's what we heard, here's what we're doing well, and here's where we're struggling, and here's what you can expect. Even if that wasn't my biggest problem, I'm going, okay, my biggest problem, they made a good case. There's a bigger problem here. Versus, and I've asked audiences this, like, raise your hand if you've done a survey and never heard anything back. I mean, we've all experienced that. It has the opposite effect of what you're trying to do. So I think that was a good opportunity to just share that this is not just an exercise to get leaders data, and don't miss the bigger picture. This is an opportunity to build trust and bring your employees into this process of developing, designing your organization and your culture as things change and evolve.
Really good. Helping all people feel like they've got a seat at the table. So, Craig, I wish we had a lot more time. I know I already told you before we got started. I'm like, we need to talk a lot more, way more than this episode. So, listeners, if you want more time to go deeper, hit Craig up. He's going to give us his information here in a little bit, and you can, find him wherever he shares. But I know that he can definitely take a look at like what you're doing to give ideas of like, what are suggested areas for your measurement and how to do it. It's not just a survey like he shared. And what are the inputs, not focused on the outcomes, these core things to be focused on, in our daily efforts. So I'm excited to do more and learn more myself. But Craig, we need to go over to the lightning round because we're running out of time. And the lightning round, it's like real quick because these are like deep questions, but it's like your quickest answer about them. So just stick with me on that. The first one's easy, I think, for that. If you could pick one book, we've been doing this for 6 years, favorite book of all time or favorite recent read, you get to add to our list with your favorite. What is it?
I mean, the book that really just stands out for me, and it hits both personally and at the meta level, was Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. That was a big one, a pretty big game changer, both for me, but like I've sort of got in and I incorporated it, and I can see I've played with that idea that vulnerability is power, that people see it as courageous, and flipping that and pushing myself to be more open and vulnerable, and how it's worked for me in my life.
So I hear, Craig, that you have a top secret life of some kind. Tell me more.
Had top secret life. So something people might not know about me is that I mentioned on this call that I was in the military. I was in the United States Air Force, and that was part of how I got myself through college, is I used the GI Bill. But while I was in, I had the opportunity. My role was I was a linguist, and I worked for intelligence, the NSA, and I held a top secret clearance, but like a TSSCI, if anybody knows, that's kind of the highest level of top secret clearance. So that's an interesting fact about me.
That's pretty cool. Whoa, that's a very small percentage of human beings that have had that experience. That's cool. Okay, so a little bird told me that you've been to Burning Man. I've always been so intrigued by Burning Man. So in case anyone's listening and they're like, what is that? Can you tell them what that is? And then just like give us a little insight on what was the experience?
Well, that was part of the reason that made it so interesting, because it was so hard for me to understand or explain it. I moved out to California, and if you live, people from a lot of places go, but if you live out here, it's closer. It's basically in Black Rock. It's in Reno. It's as bleak as a desert spot as you can imagine. It's in Nevada. There's nothing happening there most of the time, but for a week, 2 weeks, a year, about 70,000 people come out to this blank canvas, this blank, I would say desert, but it's a prehistoric ocean or lake bed, and create an experience, and then it disappears. And everybody would come home. Living out here, I'd just see people come back every year, and I'd ask questions, and I could never get my head around it. So I had the opportunity one year to go, and I went out to experience it for myself.
That's cool. What's the one word that you would say wraps up that experience for you?
Overwhelming.
Makes me want to do it more now. Is that weird? Is that weird that you said overwhelming and I want to go? I don't know.
I was you.
Okay. And I heard that there is a lot of interest in like a hobby that you spend a lot of time on, maybe even like booking little side hustles with this hobby. What is that?
Yeah, a big part of my life has been playing music. So I'm a musician. I'm a guitar player. For many years, it was just something I did on my own, and it became a very personal thing. But in the last, later in life, I, just continued with it. And so now I do play. As a matter of fact, I'm preparing right now. We're doing a show tomorrow, and it's another kind of expression in my life that's still with me. And I love playing guitar. I love music. I love live music, and being able to create it's just a real joy.
Yeah. I always say music can transform any situation. It's just, it just can completely change the vibe. You can be in the worst mood. And then
you say that, last night I went to rehearsal and I'd gotten an email that kind of spun me out a little bit. And I like literally just before I walked in, and I was like, am I gonna be able to do this? Am I in the right headspace? And it's one of those things you kind of can't be in two places. It forces full presence. And I think something meditative about that. And I think that's really nice in a world where it's so easy to future trip or get caught up on stuff. You kind of can't do that if you're playing music, especially if you're playing with other people.
Yes. So true. All right. Wrap us up with how can we connect with you? And don't forget to tell people about your podcast.
Well, first of all, easy, like LinkedIn. I've always been a LinkedIn guy. I even worked there a little bit. So please find me on LinkedIn, connect with me. I love it. But learn more about me at www.culturecraig.com. You can learn more about my work, what I'm up to. Also, there's a link there to my podcast, Culture Conversations. Much like this, really, it's not super scripted. I just have gotten to know so many amazing people along the way. I'm naturally driven by curiosity. So as I started my own work, I thought I'm going to start reaching out to those people and having those conversations. And it's really focused on people I know that I can converse with and that are out in the world doing the work, not just talking about it.
Okay, Craig, fast friends here. Love this episode. The title, How to Use Data to Lead People and Culture. Gosh, so aligned with gut plus science, right? It's about our gut and our hearts and our intuitiveness mixed with the data side of things and how to be that compassionate human that leads from the heart and with love. And gosh, there's so much good in this episode, and I've got a lot of truth you can act on here. So number one, the purpose has to be clear in order for the fear to be overcome or people to come on board. The purpose, why we are doing this. It helps people to override the other things, all of the other feelings or things that they have barrier wise. Number two, regular data reviews actually help us lessen the lift of the work. So if you think chunking things down, eating the elephant one bite at a time or whatever they say, rather than let's do a 3-year or even a 1-year data review, it's like, let's do small segments, a few questions, and it just really helps to lessen the lift, which then shows our people that we are taking action because it's so much more manageable. So that leads me to number 3, make it simple. Number 4, data tells a story to help make decisions collectively, because when all people at a table that think differently, different backgrounds, come to something, you have your biases and your emotions and whatever. And data tells a story so that we can be on the same page faster. Number 5, don't forget you can't outsource people and culture leadership. Like it's like sales. No one, except for people that really get trained about a company or have worked with someone for a long time. You can't sell something that you're not in it, Well, it's even bigger with people and culture. I love the point that Craig said about focus on the inputs versus the outcomes. And that applies to all areas of life. 7, data can be compassionate. And it's a great intention too. That really piqued my interest. It's not like, oh my gosh, it's so scary to look at this data. We can use data and we can be compassionate with that data. There are ways to do that. And I think it's honestly one of the reasons why you should hit Craig up, because it seems like that is a jam for him. And number 8, make sure you have the ability to slice and dice data to get to the most meaningful learnings. We want to lead meaningful work and find out what is really at the heart and center of the people and what makes them tick and all the things. And so we have to get to the most meaningful learnings. Therefore, anything you have for data needs to be able to slice and dice to get to a niche little nugget. And number 9, data helps people feel seen, heard, and valued. Yes, because we are asking them for their feedback, their opinion, their answers, their stories. And then we can take that data and be able to let them know we heard you and we want to make a change because we want this to be different. So with that, Craig, we will be longtime friends. Can't wait to get back together. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this. And I'm curious to know, how are you using data to move your people and culture forward? See you next time. We just left the world a little bit better. Now, go do something with it.